October 14th, 2003 began the way bad days always begin in harvest season. Quietly, with no warning, under a sky so clear and cold it looked like glass. Roy Detmer had been awake since 4:30, not because an alarm had gone off, but because harvestmen don't sleep through October where they sleep through February. Their bodies know the difference. Somewhere in the biological circuitry that 40 years of farming builds into a man, Roy's internal clock registered that there were soybeans standing in the south field, that the moisture had dropped to 13% overnight, and that a window this clean wouldn't last past the weekend. He was 61 years old that morning. He farmed 280 acres in Cass County, Illinois. The same ground his father had broken, the same ground his father had first turned with borrowed walking plow in 1921. The farmstead sat 7 miles southeast of Virginia, Illinois, on a stretch of Sangamon River bottomland that produced exceptional yields in good years and tested a man's character in bad ones. The south field was the problem field, had been for 30 years. 63 acres of the richest, darkest, most productive soil in the county, and underneath it, a clay substratum so dense and moisture-retaining that it turned the top 8 inches of that field into something close to sponge when the rains came wrong. In wet years, the south field stayed soft a full 3 weeks after every other field on the farm had firmed up. Roy's father called it the patient's field, not as a compliment but as a warning. Roy had been farming around that clay for his entire adult life. He knew where the wet pockets ran. He knew which roads to approach from the north and which to approach from the south. He knew that a morning that looked ready might not be ready at noon, and that a field that felt firm at the edges could hide something entirely different 30 yards in. He knew all of this, had known it since he was 19 years old, and had watched his father high-center a grain wagon in that same southeast corner and spend the better part of an afternoon getting it out. The salesman who showed up at Roy's farm that September had not known any of it, and that's where this story really begins. Let me tell you about the salesman, because you need to understand what he represented before you can understand what he did. His name was Todd Bremer. He was 34 years old, 12 years into a career selling agricultural equipment for a dealership out of Beardstown that had grown considerably during the late 90s farm expansion. Todd was good at his job in a way that people are good at jobs that reward confidence over depth. He knew the spec sheets were cold. He knew the financing options. He knew how to stand next to a machine and make a farmer feel that whatever he currently owned was quietly embarrassing. He drove to Roy's place on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of September 2003, uninvited, because Roy's name had come up on a list of Cass County operators who were still running older harvesting equipment. The dealership had been running a preseason combined promotion, and Todd had been assigned a rural route. Roy was in the equipment shed when the truck pulled in. He came out wiping his hands on a shop rag and found Todd already walking a slow circle around a 1952 Farmall Super M that sat parked along the east wall of the shed, used most recently that spring for cultivation work and light field prep. The Farmall Super M had been manufactured by International Harvester from 1952 through 1954 at their Rock Island, Illinois plant. It was powered by a 264 cubic inch 4-cylinder gasoline engine producing approximately 44 bell horsepower, and it weighed in at just under 6,000 pounds. Roy's example was not a show tractor. The hood had a long, shallow crease from a fence post incident in 1987. The seat had been recovered twice. The rubber on the rear wheels was newer than everything else by 30 years. But the engine ran clean. Roy had gone through the carburetor the previous winter, lapped the valves, replaced the magneto points, and adjusted the governor until the idle was as steady as a clock. He knew every sound that tractor made and what each sound meant. Todd looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already decided is worthless. "That thing is still running?" he asked, not quite hiding the amusement in his voice. Roy looked at him. "Every day I need it to. Todd smiled the kind of smile that isn't really a smile, the one that means he'd heard an answer that confirmed what he already thought. He moved toward the combine parked deeper in the shed, a 1979 IH 1460 that Roy had purchased used in 1991 and maintained with the same thoroughness he applied to everything mechanical he owned. The pitch that followed lasted about 40 minutes. Todd walked Roy through the spec sheet on a new case IH 2388, a machine that had been updated for the 2003 model year, with an improved feeder house design and a larger grain tank. 197 horsepower, 320 bushel grain tanks, straw chopper standard. It was, Todd said, the kind of machine that could handle Roy's acreage in 2 days instead of 4. The price, finance over 7 years, came to $252,000. Roy listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he asked one question. Have you ever harvested bottomland clay? He said. Todd said that the 2388 performed across all soil types and had excellent ground clearance for challenging terrain. Roy nodded slowly and said he'd think about it. Todd left the brochure on the workbench and drove back to Beardstown. He told the other salesman at the dealership that evening that the Detmer place was a dead lead. The old man was too attached to his antiques to make a rational equipment decision. He used the word antiques. Here's where I want to stop and ask you something directly. Somewhere in your life, maybe in your family, maybe in your work, there's been a person like Roy, someone who didn't talk much, didn't explain themselves, didn't feel any particular need to prove what they knew to someone who hadn't earned the right to doubt them, someone whose competence lived in their hands and their habits rather than their vocabulary. If you know a person like that, or if you grew up watching someone like that, drop their name in the comments right now. It doesn't matter if they farmed or welded or ran a sawmill, or just kept an old machine running long past when everyone else said to give up on it. Tell me who they were and where you're watching from, because this story is about that kind of person, and those people deserve to be named. Now, let's get back to Cass County. Roy did not buy the case IH 2388 in September of 2003. He did not call Todd Bremer back. He did not go to the dealership in Beardstown or attend the open house they held in early October. What Roy did in the 3 weeks between Todd's visit and the morning of October 14th was finish his pre-harvest inspection on the 1460, replace a worn elevator chain, calibrate the cylinder speed, and walk his south field 4 times at different times of day to assess moisture conditions at the surface and 6 inches down. He pushed a half-inch steel rod into the ground at 23 different points across those 63 acres. He recorded the resistance at each point in a small spiral notebook he'd been using for field notes since 1991. He built a map in his head of where the clay was still holding moisture and where it had released it. On the morning of October 14th, he looked at his notes over breakfast, looked at the sky, and decided the field was ready. He was right about his field. The question was whether anyone else would be right about theirs. That answer arrived at Roy Detmer's farm at 9:30 that morning, from the direction of his neighbor's property to the south, in the form of sound that every farmer in the bottomland country recognizes immediately and hopes never to hear. The sound of an engine screaming against a load cannot move. Roy set his coffee cup down and was out the back door before the sound had fully registered in his wife's expression. He knew the sound. Every farmer who has worked in the bottomland long enough knows it. That particular pitch of a diesel engine pushing past its rated torque in the range where something is about to give, where the machine is no longer working the ground but fighting it, where the ground is winning. It is not a sound that gets better if you wait. It gets worse or it stops, and neither outcome is good. He crossed his equipment shed in 6 steps, climbed into the cab of his pickup, and drove the half-mile of field road to the south boundary fence in under 3 minutes. What he found on the other side of that fence would be described as the Farmers Co-op in Virginia. Illinois for the next decade whenever the subject of new equipment came up in conversation. Let me tell you about Roy's neighbor, because he matters to this story the way a mirror matters, not as the main subject, but as the thing that shows you what you're looking at. His name was Dennis Hock. He was 53 years old, farmed 410 acres spread across 2 parcels in Cass County, and had purchased a brand new Case H 2388 combine that Todd Bremer had been promoting. Not from Todd specifically, but from the same Beardstown dealership 3 weeks after Todd's visit to Roy's farm. Dennis had been the lead. The Salesman had actually closed. Dennis was not a reckless farmer. He was not careless or arrogant in the way that invites easy judgment. He was a reasonably skilled operator who had spent 20 years building his operation incrementally, made his decisions carefully, and in the fall of 2003 had concluded that upgrading to a larger, more efficient machine was the right call for where his operation was headed. The financing was workable. The logic was sound. The timing felt right. What Dennis did not fully account for, what the Salesman spec sheet had not covered, and what no dealership brochure ever covers, was a specific character of the ground he was asking that machine to work. Dennis farmed the parcel immediately south of Roy's property. His ground shared the same Sangamon River bottomland geology, the same clay substratum, the same tendency to hold moisture in the low pockets long after the surface had dried to a crust that looked and felt like solid footing. His south parcel and Roy's south field were, geologically speaking, the same field divided by a fence line. The difference was that Roy had been reading his ground for 40 years and Dennis had been reading his for 20. 20 years is enough to know a field. It is not always enough to know what the field is hiding. Dennis had walked his south parcel the evening before. The surface had felt firm. The forecast was clear. He'd made the call to start there first, reasoning that getting the low ground done early would give him flexibility in the schedule if weather moved in later that week. He had driven the 2,388 into that field at 8:15 in the morning. By 9:25, the machine was immovable. Now let me tell you exactly what happened, because the mechanics of it matter. The 2388 weighed approximately 36,000 pounds empty, with a full grain tank, and Dennis had been making good progress in the northwest corner of the field where the ground was firmer. It was carrying closer to 42,000 pounds. That weight, distributed across the combine's drive axle, translated into ground pressure that the surface crust of that southeast pocket had held for perhaps 4 passes before it stopped holding. The rear drive wheels broke through the crust on a slight downhill approach to the low point. Once the crust failed, the clay beneath it, saturated, dense, with consistency of cold putty, provided almost no bearing capacity. The rear axle dropped 6 inches in under 2 seconds. The machine's momentum carried it forward another 8 feet before the belly of the header clearance frame contacted the surface. The combine was not stuck in the way a car gets stuck in snow, where the wheels spin and the machine sits essentially on top of its problem. It was stuck in the way that bottomland clay sticks things, from underneath, with a suction that increases with every attempt to move, where the machine's own weight becomes a mechanism of its imprisonment. Each time Dennis tried to power out, the drive wheels found new perches on deeper clay and pulled the belly of the machine down rather than forward. He tried for 22 minutes before he shut the engine down. When Roy arrived at the fence line and looked across, the 2388 was sitting with its rear axle buried to the differential housing, its header resting on the clay surface at an angle that suggested at least another 4 to 6 inches of settling since the engine had stopped. The grain tank was 3/4 full. The machine was not going anywhere under its own power, and it was not going anywhere under the power of anything Dennis currently owned. Dennis was standing beside it with his phone to his ear, already calling the dealership. Roy leaned on his fence post and watched for a moment. He did not call out. He did not wave. He just looked at the machine, at its size, at the angle of its settlement, at the surface around the drive wheels where the clay had folded up and over tire lugs like a slow cold wave, and made a series of quiet assessments. Then he walked back to his truck and drove to his equipment shed. The call Dennis made to the Beardstown dealership at 9:31 that morning reached Todd Bremer at his desk. Todd had sold the machine. He was a logical first contact. Todd asked the standard questions. How deep are the drive wheels? Is the machine on a slope? Have you tried differential lock? Dennis answered all of them. Todd told him he'd make some calls and find out what recovery options were available in the area. He said he'd call back within the hour. He called back in 40 minutes with a number of a heavy equipment recovery service out of Springfield. The recovery service, when Dennis reached them, quoted a mobilization fee of $1,800 and said they could be on site the following morning. The following morning, Dennis looked at his grain tank. 3/4 full of soybeans that needed to come out before the machine could be lightened enough to consider moving. He looked at the sky. He looked at the field. He looked at the header resting on the surface of his best soybean ground. He hung up and called Roy Detmer. The phone rang 4 times. Roy picked up from the shop, where he had already been for the past 30 minutes. "I know," Roy said before Dennis had finished his first sentence. "I saw it from the fence line. Come over. Let me stop here and ask you something, because this is a part of the story where most people assume they know what happens next. They assume Roy drove the little Farmall over, hooked a chain to the big combine, and pulled it out while the salesman watched with his mouth open. That's a satisfying image. It's the image the title suggests, and there is truth in it. But what actually happened over the next 6 hours was more complicated, more methodical, and in some ways more instructive than a simple pull. Because Roy Detmer didn't just have an old tractor. He had a system. He had knowledge. He had 40 years of thinking about exactly this kind of problem on exactly this kind of ground. And the first thing he told Dennis when Dennis walked into his equipment shed was not about the Farmall at all. It was about, wait, you can't pull that machine out loaded, Roy said. You pull 42,000 pounds through saturated clay with anything short of a bulldozer. You'll either snap a chain or pull the axle housing. The first thing we do is get the grain out. Dennis stared at him. How? Roy pointed to the 1460 combine parked along the shed wall. I'll run my machine in from the north approach where the ground is firm, he said. We auger your tank into my grain wagon. Lighten the load. Then we talked about moving it. Dennis looked at the 1460, 24 years old, patched in 2 places on the feeder house, running on the same basic platform that Roy's father had coveted in 1979. That machine can get in there? Dennis asked. Roy looked at him with the level expression of a man who does not waste words explaining things that his results will explain for him. It's gotten in there before, he said. Roy did not rush. That was the first thing Dennis noticed. Given that 42,000 pounds of Dennis's most expensive purchase was sinking incrementally into a Cass County clay pocket, while the October morning burned off its dew, Roy Detmer moved with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that speed and urgency are not the same thing. Urgency meant the problem was in charge. Speed without a correct plan meant a second machine in the mud beside the first. Roy walked the perimeter of Dennis's south parcel for 11 minutes before he touched a single piece of equipment. He walked it the way he had walked his own south field 4 times in the weeks before harvest, rod in hand, pushing it into the ground at intervals, reading resistance, building a map. He tested the north approach that he had referenced in the shed. He found the firm corridor, a narrow band of ground that ran along the field's highest contour, where the clay substratum sat deeper and the drainage had done its work. 40 feet wide, he told Dennis when he came back. If I stay in that corridor, I can get the 1460 within 60 feet of your machine. That's close enough to run the auger. Dennis had been on the phone twice more while Roy walked the field. The recovery service in Springfield had confirmed their morning availability. A farmer 2 counties east whom Dennis had called as a long shot had a large tractor he could bring, but not until late afternoon. Every option was slow. Every option was expensive. Every option required waiting. Roy's option required waiting for nothing. He was already moving. He brought the 1460 in from the north at just past 11 o'clock, following the corridor he had mapped on foot, running the machine at half throttle with the header raised to its full height to keep the weight distribution as far rearward as possible. He had done this before, not with this specific machine in this specific field, but with the same principles applied to the same geology on his own ground for 4 decades. He knew how much the 1460 weighed, where that weight sat, and how the clay beneath his feet would respond to it. He stopped the machine at 53 feet from the buried combine, set the brake, and climbed down to assess the surface between them. He walked it twice. He pushed the rod in at 6 points. He came back and moved the 1460 11 feet further along the corridor to a position where the ground below was measurably firmer. Then he ran the grain auger out. The auger on the 1460 reached 41 feet at full extension, with the grain wagon pulled up behind Roy's combine and the auger angled correctly. They could transfer Dennis's soybeans without either machine moving an inch closer to the wet pocket. It took 1 hour and 40 minutes to empty the grain tank. Roy ran the 1460's engine at a steady 1,800 revolutions per minute throughout, never varying, never rushing, monitoring the machine the way a man monitors something he trusts but respects. Dennis drove the grain wagon. Neither man said much. The work had its own language, and they both spoke it. When the 2,388's grain tank read empty, Roy shut down the 1460, climbed down, and walked back to the stuck machine. He pushed his rod into the clay around the drive wheels and tires at 8 different points. He stood up and looked at the sky, then back at the machine. She settled another 2 inches since this morning, he said. That clay's still got moisture moving up from below. We move her now, or we move her tomorrow with different equipment. Dennis said, now. Roy nodded once and walked back to his equipment shed without another word. Let me tell you what he came back with, because this is the moment the title earns itself. He came back with the 1952 Farmall Super M, not a bulldozer, not a 4-wheel drive row crop tractor, not a dedicated recovery vehicle with a hydraulic winch and outrigger stabilizers. The tractor that Todd Bremer had looked at 6 weeks earlier with amusement in his eyes, and the word antique forming behind his teeth. Roy had hitched a heavy logging chain to the Farmall's drawbar, 3/4-inch forged steel links, each one rated beyond what the tractor's own engine could break, and coiled the excess in a loader bucket he'd fitted to the front axle. He drove it across the field road, through the gate Dennis had opened, and along the north corridor at a walking pace, reading the ground with his eyes the way he'd read it with the rod that morning. He stopped the Farmall 30 feet from the 2388 and climbed down. Now let me stop here and explain something that the spec sheet crowd never accounts for, because it is the technical heart of this entire story. The Farmall Super M ran on a 4-cylinder engine that produced, at the drawbar, approximately 36 horsepower under continuous load. That is not an impressive number by any modern standard. Todd Bremer's 2388 produced 197 horsepower. Dennis's own field tractor produced 145. But horsepower was not what that clay pocket required. What it required was drawbar pull delivered low, slow, and steady, sustained tension applied without shock loading, without wheel spin, without the torque spikes that modern transmissions generate when a driver asks for power in a hurry. The physics of extracting a machine from saturated clay demands patience from the pulling force. A sudden jerk transfers energy into the stuck machine as vibration rather than forward motion, and vibration in saturated clay creates liquefaction. It makes the grip worse, not better. You do not snatch a machine out of clay. You persuade it. The Farmall Super M, with its direct gear transmission, its rear wheel weight of just under 3,000 pounds per side, and its low governed engine speed that delivered torque in a long even pull rather than a spike, was not the most powerful option available. It was the most appropriate one. And Roy Detmer knew the difference because he had spent 50 years learning that appropriate and powerful are not the same word. He hooked the chain to the 2388's main frame, not the axle housing, not the hitch point, but the main frame, where the load would transfer through the machine's structural spine rather than a single component. He checked the hook twice. He walked the chain length and confirmed it was clear of the tires and the header. Then he climbed back up onto the Farmall and looked at Dennis. "Stay back from the chain," he said, "and don't watch the machine. Watch the ground around the tires. You'll see it move before you hear it." He put the Farmall in second gear, eased the clutch out to the friction point, and held it there for 4 full seconds before he let it fully engage. The ground moved first, exactly as Roy had said it would. A slow heave in the clay surface around the 2388's rear tires. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet shift in the skin of the earth that told anyone watching closely enough that something below had changed its mind about holding on. Dennis saw it. He had done what Roy told him and watched the ground instead of the machine. And so he was looking at exactly the right place when the clay released its first concession. A ripple, a breath, the faintest suggestion of movement in something that had been immovable for 4 hours. The Farmall did not roar. It did not surge or spin or throw dirt. It pulled the way Roy had described, low, steady, unbroken. The engine note rising perhaps 50 RPM above idle, and holding there, the rear tires finding the firm subsoil beneath the soft surface and walking on it rather than through it. The logging chain came fully taut and stayed taut, a rigid iron line between 51 years of cast iron and $252,000 of modern harvesting technology. For 3 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then the 2388 moved. Not dramatically. Not in the way that machinery failures tend to resolve in the stories people tell afterward, with a sudden lurch and a cheer. It moved where the clay had released. Quietly, with a deep sucking sound that carried across the field and said everything about what kind of grip that ground had held. 6 inches. A foot. 2 feet. The rear axle housing rising from the hole it had pressed into the clay over 4 hours of settling. The header lifting off the surface. The machine finding its own weight and taking it back. Roy held the pull steady for a full 40 feet. Before he stopped the Farmall and climbed down to look. He checked the chain, checked the ground under the 2388's tires, walked a slow circle around the machine, looking at the belly clearance and the axle housing. He pushed the rod into the ground at 4 points around where the tires now sat. "Firm enough," he said. "Take her straight north along the high side. Don't stop until you're out of the field." Dennis climbed into the cab of the 2388 with hands that were not entirely steady. He started the engine, engaged the drive, and moved machine north along the corridor Roy pointed to. The combine rolled out at South Pocket and across the field boundary and onto the field road without incident. And when Dennis finally stopped and climbed down, his legs carried the particular unsteadiness of a man who has just watched something very expensive come very close to being a total loss. He stood beside his combine on the field road and looked back at the pocket in the clay where the machine had sat. Then he looked at Roy, who was unhooking the logging chain from the Farmall's drawbar with the same unhurried movements he applied to everything. Dennis didn't say anything for a long moment. Roy coiled the chain without looking up. When Dennis finally spoke, he didn't say thank you first. He said, "How did you know it would hold?" Roy set the coiled chain in the loader bucket and straightened up. He looked at the Farmall the way a man looks at something he has worked alongside long enough to trust completely. "It's held before," he said. "Different field, same clay, different year." He paused. "This tractor has been pulling things out of this county's ground since before either of us was farming it. The clay didn't change. The machine didn't change. I just hadn't know which approach to take." Dennis looked at the Farmall, the crease in the hood, the re-welded seat casting, the rear tires that were newer than everything else by 3 decades, and said nothing. Roy climbed back on the tractor and started it. Before he drove it back to the gate, he looked at Dennis one more time. "Call your salesman," Roy said. "Tell him the machine is out, and tell him the next time he's selling equipment to bottomland farmers. He might want to ask them about their clay before he laughs at what they're already running." He drove the Farmall back along the corridor at a walking pace, through the gate and across the field road toward his own shed. Todd Bremer heard the story secondhand, the way people in small counties hear most things, through a third party, over a meal, with the details already sharpened by a retelling or two. He did not call Roy Detmer. He did not drive back out to the Detmer place. There was nothing to say that the story hadn't already said more plainly than he could. Dennis Hock finished his harvest that season 11 days after the incident. He ran his 2,388 on every acre of firm ground and ran Roy's borrowed 1460 on the south parcel's low pockets, following the corridor Roy had mapped, staying on the high contour, reading the field the way Roy had taught him in one afternoon what 20 years of working hadn't. The 1952 Farmall Super M is still on the Detmer farm. Roy's son runs the operation now. He's added 200 acres and upgraded the combine twice since 2003. The Farmall does what it's always done: light field work, odd jobs, the tasks that don't require 140 horsepower, but do require a machine that starts clean on a cold morning and doesn't need a diagnostic computer to tell you what it's doing. It has pulled 3 more machines out of that same south parcel since October 2003. Each time, the principle was the same: low gear, steady pull, chain to the main frame. Watch the ground before you watch the machine. Some fields teach the same lesson every generation. The ones that learn it early stop paying for ones that don't.